I really want to tell their stories with justice and truth. I hope I've done so, but I will let you be the judge. So we'll focus on the parishioners who made St. Charles their faith community for the first 25 years. But why them? When I was working with Mary Jane Klein, I found the first account book for St. Charles. That was a big find. We didn't know we had it. The account book included references to Irish immigrants, which we had expected, but also free blacks, enslaved people, and some historically significant families. The latter we did expect as well, given our windows. But it indicated a very complex socioeconomic community, one that maybe we weren't expecting. And as I begin researching the update to the history book that I'm doing, essentially the last 25 years, I got to thinking about the first 25 years. So this is the story of the beginning of the faith community of St. Charles and the people who laid the foundation for us. So through the ages, it is the sacraments that have linked generations of Catholics. So it makes sense to look at the sacramental record in the first 25 years as a document detailing the lives of the people involved in the parish then. The first sacramental book includes baptisms, first communions, confirmations, marriages, and burials. But the time frame for each is somewhat different. The book is actually a little confusing, but so we have baptisms from 1848 to 1871. The first being August 15th, 1848. First communions in that book are much later. I don't think they kept track of first communions early on. So they're all late dates. Confirmations are from 52 to 1940, which seems a little long, but the first one was in 1852. Marriages and burials, also again in the time frame that we're talking about, which is really 1848 to 1874. That's the first 25 years. So I'm not going to be using any First Communion records. They're outside my time range. So we had 561 baptisms in this parish in those 25 years. But we also had 210 confirmations, 53 marriages, and 82 burials. Marriages are probably a little low because you have to remember in those 25 years, we went from pre-Civil War, Civil War, and post-Civil War. Very tumultuous time, and there weren't any marriages in some of the years during the war. There are sponsors and witnesses named as well for both baptisms and marriages. So there are a lot of names, a lot of people. So how could these records tell us about the parishioners of the first 25 years? You can't see it too well. If you ever want to see the original document, every page has been scanned in and you can find it on Find My Past. That's where I just downloaded these. We still have the book, the original, but if you want to look at the scanned images, they're available for free. So the records identify early parishioners by name and sometimes age. In the aggregate that's together, when used with other genealogical resources, the records can describe the racial and socioeconomic makeup of St. Charles Borromeo. And the records can show us which families were most involved just by tracking their family names. So that's what I did. I've looked at family names. But I wanted an unbiased way of searching through those names because as an individual, I was looking at names going, oh, that's an interesting name, or gee, that sounds familiar. That wasn't unbiased. So I thought of a way of really looking at the entire community. And the first thing I did, I just counted the number of instances, that's this one here, of the family name, just the last name, and all the spelling variations. And believe me, some of those names had a lot of spelling variations. And it didn't matter whether the person was male or female, I just counted the family name. And then I identified families who showed up as principals in at least 2 sacraments. These were then ranked by their record count, and ones with 5 or more records were kept. But that yielded 71 family names. That was a little too much for me to do genealogical research on. So I narrowed the field a little more. I decided confirmation had to be one of the sacraments included, since it was the second most numerous sacrament. And I raised the record number to 10. And with those parameters, I reduced the number of families down to 32, especially when some families were sort of collapsed into others. That meant when I was researching a family, it had 10 records, but all of those records were related to people they were married to in another family. So if one family encompassed all of the records of a second family, they were joined together. And you'll see that on the data sheet that I have in the back. If you don't have it, you're not going to be able to read it in the dark anyway, but it's for something for you to take home. So these 32 families were considered the most involved families, and their genealogies was conducted. So, genealogical sources, primarily censuses 1850, 1860, 1870, through that time period. As I was researching certain families, I did before and after, but the 1850 census is crucial. It is the first census in the United States that has names. All censuses before that only had heads of households and age groups. The ones afterwards were just out of my time frame, and I didn't have to deal with them. I also used the St. Charles account book because he not only had his money coming and going, he also had the funds. So when they started a fund to raise money, he had people's names in there and where they were living. So it was a very valuable resource. Also newspaper articles, Find a Grave, which is a website. If you're not familiar with it, pictures of all the stones out back are on there. You just search it by name, and you can pick up a gravesite. Then there were miscellaneous records, whichever I happened to run across. Sometimes it was an ancestry tree, and then there were published family histories of the people you would expect to have published histories, like the Carrolls. But this allowed me to sort through families and to sort the most involved families from transient families. It also gave an overview of where they had come from, because in the censuses they would usually have the country of origin or state of origin, where they were born. It also mentioned their occupations. Some of the censuses have your real estate, how much it's valued at. And of course, from our records, their participation and what kind of participation they had. I also have a map of where these parishioners were living in 1850, which you'll see. So there are resources to pinpoint where these people were. It allowed me to make a summary and timeline for each involved family at St. Charles, and that is what that sheet has. That's the compilation of everything. And then I could produce personal histories for some of the selected families that seem to be more interesting than others. So the aggregated data. Because the baptismal records were so extensive, I used that alone for the percentages. It was just easier. Confirmation tended to be just a name and when they were confirmed. It did not give me any other connections. Baptismal records, you have the child, you have the parents, you have the sponsors. Much more extensive. Sacramental records were combined with genealogical data for an analysis of the most involved families' occupations and wealth. So we have the socio-demographic information for the most involved family. So, using father's name only, 33% were from the most involved families. That's a lot when you only have 32 families, but 33% of the baptismal records come from them. They're involved. 26% were one-time records. This was an Irish immigrant area, so immigrants were coming through and they weren't staying. They'd have a child, get it baptized, and head on out. So I consider that suggesting transiency. In between, there were a lot of families that were 2, 3, baptisms, but not sufficient to be, included. 6% were black, that either free black or enslaved. At the time, Baltimore County was 14% black, also free black plus enslaved. So for our 32 most involved families, 23% were landowners, and 11% were black, and over half enslaved. So we have a larger proportion of black families involved in St. Charles than you would have expected. Okay. So, in the first 25 years, the most involved parishioners of St. Charles included very wealthy landowners. We know about Lawrenson, who married a Carroll. I didn't know about Weiss, whose farm was called Deer Park. Have you heard that one before? Well-connected families like Carrolls and Winans, they were before the Civil War. But after the Civil War, we have Dorsey, Tubman, and Abel. Abel, he started the Baltimore Sun. There were doctors, storekeepers, farmers, laborers, and a soldier or two. Remember, we were right across, the arsenal is right down the road, so yes, we had soldiers here as well. Most were recent Irish immigrants, but there were also what I call pre-famine Irish immigrants. That is, they came before 1830. And we had immigrants from other countries. When you get a chance to look at the data, you'll see France, Germany, and England. Though the English is the Tubmans, and they were after the war, so I'm not sure you can really count them as immigrants. But French was a surprise. We also had free blacks and enslaved people. That's the table, and I'm sorry, it's not any more readable here. That's a lot of data, and I had to get it down to one page. It makes it difficult. But at the top, these are just the names. Feel free to look at it later, and then you'll be able to find where they were born, what their occupations were, what the value of land was, if they gave money to St. Charles. During this time frame, there were 3 funds that were set up. There was the St. Charles Fund, there was the Confraternity of the Blessed Virgin Mary, and there was the Renovation Fund, a repair fund, I think they called it. And some of these people also loaned money to the church, and that is listed in the account book. So that's the actual number of records that I used, the biggest being 143 records. The next lowest is like almost half that. But they also had the most, I counted 13 adults that were active. So they had the most people being active. So it's not surprising they had the most records. And over in this column, you'll see those are the various sacraments that they were involved in. Almost all of them were doing, birth through burial. There's a few that missed maybe a burial or two. But for the most part, they were involved in all the sacraments. And over here, this is not color-coded. People ask me. It's just a way so you can see the lines. But you can see who started early and who came late, and that's all that those bars do. But the handout is really for someone to look at later, just to prove that I did a lot of work. There were other active families. Remember I said I went from 71 down to 32? These are the other that I didn't do. There's some names in here. I mean, the Carrolls weren't quite as big as the Lawrences. Walsh, I don't know if that's Chris's Welch's family name or not. Spelling, I don't even know if that's two families or one, because spelling is so bad. And I know the Rickards-Ricard, I know it's all the same family, but don't ask me which name is right, because I saw both. So, and I know this is going to be hard to see, that the map over here covers the 4 districts that primarily fed into Pikesville. And I know you can't see them, but all those little white names and some green and yellow are names of parishioners I could find. The ones up here, they're out in Reisterstown. Didn't even want to fit them on the map, because then the map was bad enough. So I took a snapshot down here. There's the church, there's the arsenal. Dr. Lawrence Burns, we'll be talking about him. We'll be talking about some barons. The General Howard estate, that is John Edgar Howard. The McHenry estate, that's his son-in-law's estate, whose name was Sudbrook. Guess where that's at? So most of them are within very close range of Pikesville. That's all I wanted to show. The map is from 1850. If you want to, it is searchable by name. And you can find it at the Legacy of Slavery at the Maryland Archives. This is a landowner's map. It is not a slave owner's map. So it just gives you who has land. You have to go double check in the slave schedules to find out who actually were enslavers. And I did. So these are the selected families. So when I combined all these sacramental records and the genealogical data for the most involved families, as the data accumulated, some of the families stood out for various reasons. But I will tell you right now, there's going to be more questions left than answers. These are the families I selected. Barons, they're the most active family. That's line 1 on that table. So I had to do them. Corbett. This was a politically active family in the area. Very interesting when I got into their genealogy. The Purvians. This was an enslaved family whom I could not find after the war. They certainly had left this area, but I couldn't find them anyplace. The main people, I could find their children, and we'll go through that. The heirs, 2 sisters, very active, and who stayed at St. Charles past the war. And then 2 families, the Burns and the Jones. I could not really separate them, and you'll see why. But the Burns that was an enslaver. He had slaves. The Jones were free blacks. And I found that extremely interesting. So let's go with the Barron family, the most involved family. It has the most sacramental records. As near as I can tell, it was multiple brothers or cousins who came over about the same time, but not necessarily together. That I could find immigration records for some of them, but not others, and they were never in a large group. But all just prior to 1850. It was multi-generational. You find a Baron practically from day one through 74. They were laborers. They did not own land. And during the Civil War, one was a Union soldier. They were acting with all the sacraments, not only as principals, but witnesses and sponsors. These people were in church a lot. And they participated in the three major funds, the St. Charles Fund, the Confraternity of the Blessed Virgin Mary, and the 1868 Repair Fund. Now, don't be shocked at this next slide. It'll take a moment to come up. It's a big file. I hope it comes up. There it is. I could not figure out these people and who was related to whom, so I had to graph it. And all I want you to really, the take-home message is, these people were connected, back and forth and roundabout. The green here, if you see green, those are things I know for a fact. I have documentation. Yes, Margaret was Patrick's daughter, guaranteed. They lived together during a later census when she had already married but was a widow, and she went back to live with her father. Green, I love that. The rest of them, blue, probably. Data's not good, but it's reasonable. And the black that's not even bolded they're not in the sacraments, but I have an immigration record with that name on it, that with Patrick and the rest of them, so I'm guessing. But there are 3 Edwards, 3 Richards, 2 James, and 2 Johns, and trying to sort them out was not fun. So the take-home message for this really is that there are a lot of them, they're connected, and they were active. Because all those blue lines, those are baptisms. So that's the next generation coming along. Okay, let's go to the next slide. No. Okay, so the next family, the Corbetts. Politically active on both sides. That was a surprise. There's Michael Corbett. He was born in Ireland. He was a sergeant at the U.S. in the Army at the Arsenal. Interestingly, in the book, Mary Jane Klein had Sergeant Corbett as Timothy Corbett. That's not Timothy. It is Michael. She did not have access to the kind of census and data that I had the privilege of getting to. He was a master wheelwright and a carriage maker. Some things have tucked under. And he was involved in Irish relief efforts in 1848. You can find him in The Sun, where they were reporting on such things. Next one was Jacob Corbett. He was born in Maryland. He is probably Michael's son, but I can't prove it. His wife was from Pennsylvania, and he was buried there. He is a member of the Unconditional Union Party. Didn't know that there was such a party, but they were, border states had these parties that were for pro-union. And so they were, and I gather they got quite militant. No, it's the file. I have a picture on the next file. Takes a while for it to. So, Not that big a picture. Okay, well, Timothy will be up in a moment. Come on. Okay, and I have no way of going. Let's see if I can. Okay, I am technologically challenged here. Come on. We're going to have to go back to the beginning, I think. Okay, and it worked really well yesterday, I assure you. Okay, well, let's try this again. Okay, this is the one. This is that big file. Timothy. We have Timothy. He was the only person I could find a picture of. He was born in Ireland. His family was pre-famine. He was a second generation storekeeper in Pikesville. His son Robert was also here, and I found out they were storekeepers because of Robert's obituary. And eventually I did find a picture of the store, but it wasn't good enough for me to get, that it wasn't well scanned in, and it wasn't going to be pretty. But he had some money. He loaned money for the first church. But interestingly, he was in Fort McHenry as a political prisoner, as a Confederate sympathizer. He only stayed there 10 days when he took an oath of, saying, "Oh no, I'll be good." But he was one of the Confederates in the area. So obviously, if Jacob is his cousin, and I do not know if they're the same Corbett family, there's no way of knowing. But I suspect they are. But he's buried at St. Charles. You can find his stone out back. Next family. This was the Purviance family. This one actually became very interesting because they were enslaved. But they left after emancipation. So Christopher Purviance, he was recorded at St. Charles, 51 through 58. He was born enslaved in Maryland. He had 7 children baptized here at St. Charles while enslaved. F.B. Lawrenson sponsored the baptism of the first 5 children. The last 2 children were sponsored by the enslaved Ayres sisters, whom I'll talk about next. But 2 of the children were confirmed while enslaved. So this is all before, emancipation was 1863, I think. I ended up finding an extensive history on Ancestry.com. His wife's family were definitely enslaved by the Lawrences. There is documents in the legacy of slavery in Maryland, so I know that the Gray family was enslaved by the Lawrences. The ages of the Purviance children match up with the 1860 slave schedule for Lawrence. They're a year or two off, but they were guessing at ages most of the time, for the most part. But they weren't in the 1850 schedule. That suggests that the first child, which I think was baptized in 51, is probably after the slave schedule. And there were multiple adults of the appropriate ages who could be parents. If you're very fond of finding your roots, you'll know that slave schedules only list sex and age. That's it, no names. But oddly, Christopher was freed by William George Reed. William George Reed is someone who helped found this parish, and he was one of the big donors. And it was done in 1858. Christopher was age 40, but his family wasn't freed. So I'm wondering if Christopher was actually enslaved by Reed, but he married an enslaved woman in the Lawrences plantation. But I don't know. I have no way of proving that. But that's what it suggests, that the Purviance children would have gone with their mother and been, her enslaver would have been their enslaver. That was sort of the rule. But his son Peter joined the Union Army. His daughter Elizabeth, I could find in the 1870 census, living with her uncle, John Gray. And John Gray was definitely enslaved by F.B. Lawrence. I could not find Christopher or his wife at all in 1870. And given the fact that one of their younger daughters was living with an uncle, suggests that they had both passed. Peter and his sister Isabella share a gravestone at Mount Auburn Cemetery. It's hard to see. That's Isabella over there. Peter's over here. I was a little appalled at the condition of the cemetery because you can see it's overgrown. I don't know when that picture was taken. There is now a group taking care of Mount Auburn, and it looks a whole lot better on their webpage. But that's the Purviances. The kids I could find. I couldn't find the parents. And then the Ayres family. They stayed on after emancipation. There's two sisters. I say Harriet, Henrietta. What you find in the censuses is that census takers don't differentiate between Harriets and Henriettas. They go back and forth. So the same person could be a Harriet in one document and a Henrietta in another, and it's the same person. It's got the same husband, the same kids. They got all the other parameters are exactly the same, but the name has changed. Doesn't make sense, but that's the way it was. Harriet was confirmed in St. Charles in 1852. She was a baptismal sponsor for one of the Jones children. I'll be talking about the Joneses next, in 56. And she was also a sponsor for one of the Purviance children in 1858. So while she's enslaved, she's still a sponsor. After the war, she married Henry Sivia, I think, because that's one of the names that is really difficult to figure out. She did so at St. Charles in 1868, and she sponsored one of her sister Anna's children in 1869. After that, I can't find her. Anna, I did a little bit better with. She was also confirmed with her sister in 1852. She married Washington, I think it's Yearby, Handwriting is an issue. It could be yearly. His name changes in the baptismal records. He becomes Washington Irving or Irvine, suggesting that he had changed enslavers. I know they were both slaves because when they were married in 1857, they were noted as slaves in our record book. That's rare. Mostly our record book does not say slave in it at all. It just says colored. So I think maybe 4 or 5 incidents of the word slave in there. So very, very unusual. But in this case, they were noted, and it was also noted that they married with permission. From 1861 to 1869, 4 children were baptized here. And Anna was also a baptismal sponsor for one of the Purviance children in 56, and I could find her in Washington living in Randallstown in 1870. So she stayed in the area, and she stayed with St. Charles. Okay, come on, okay. I could not find their enslaver. There are lots of heir families around. I couldn't find a Yearby, I couldn't find a Yearly, I couldn't find an Irving, and I couldn't find an Irvine. There were all people of those names around here, but I couldn't confirm that they were enslavers, so I never could match up. However, the sisters may not have been living with their enslavers, because in this time frame, slaves could hire themselves out to other people, or their enslavers would hire them out to other people. So they weren't necessarily living with their enslavers. In both cases, and so you won't necessarily find them localized in Pikesville if their enslaver is, in Baltimore City, but I can't link them up. So that's, that was interesting. I found a book that told me that the enslavers and their enslaved peoples were not necessarily living together. That leaves us the last genealogy, or set of genealogies I did, and that's the Byrne and Jones families. And these two families, I just say, they're intertwined. Let's start with, these are the two families. This Dr. Lawrence Burns, he was an early Irish immigrant. His wife is Mary McSherry. McSherrys are a big family down in Virginia and some in Maryland as well. And those are their 6 children. Only Bernard was baptized here. There's John Jones. He was Maryland born. He was free black. And his wife was Mary Martin. And those are the children that were baptized here. He was an early immigrant, Dr. Burns. He actually took over his brother's practice, according to his obituary. As I mentioned, he married an old Virginia family. He did not own his own house, which struck me as odd. According to the census records anyway, he never had any real estate. So I have a feeling he may be living in his brother's house, but maybe a niece or nephew owned it. But the name is not on the map. But he did live near the arsenal, and I could tell that because in the census record, his listing goes right next door to the arsenal's listing. So, and that's how you can localize people on the censuses, because the census taker would just walk, from one house to the next. So if you find someone whose record is right next door, they're probably living right next door too. But he was an enslaver. He held 2 adult females and a girl in 1850. In 1860, he had 1 adult female and 4 children, ages 10 to 9 months, presumably the adults' children. And his youngest son was the fourth child baptized at St. Charles in 1848. His wife Mary sponsored the first baptism at St. Charles. This family liked baptisms. They were involved in 36 baptismal sponsorships, all of them outside the family. And all of his children were sponsors. All 6 of them sponsored at least one. They participated in all the fundraising activities, but did not loan money. But most of them are buried at St. Charles, and that stone is out back. Now we'll go to the Joneses. He was a free black man. He was most likely a brickmaker living south in Catonsville. I say most likely because that's the only John Jones I could find with a wife, Mary, in the area. But Catonsville is a little farther south than I would have liked to seen the record, but it fit. But from 1848 to 1860, 8 children were baptized here. He himself was baptized in 1856, we have his record, and he was confirmed in 1858, suggesting his wife was the Catholic. In 1854, his wife Mary did participate in the confraternity of Blessed Virgin Mary campaign. These people were very poor, and yet they were still donating to the church, which I find, really amazing. He did serve in the Union Army. He was drafted. He served from 1863 to 1865, and he got out with a disability. There are 3 burial records. 1853, which only has his last name on it, just says Jones. That's the only Jones in the parish, so it has to be him. But who's buried there, I don't know. He had 2 sons buried here, an infant, Louis in 1856, and a toddler, Samuel, in 1858. And please note, the cemetery back there was never segregated. So, in the 1860 census, Mary Jones and the children were found living in Pikesville without John. I had lost him, I thought, and then I found her, and I'm going, well, what happened to John? But in my research, it was noted that when the Irish immigrants came in, there was a huge problem with employment with both free blacks and enslaved blacks. The Irish would take their jobs, and the blacks would often have to leave their families to find work elsewhere. And I think in 1860, that's what happened. Mary and the kids were in Pikesville. John wasn't. There were a number of John Jones in Howard County and elsewhere, but you can't figure out which one. There were 2 sons in the 1850 census who were not in the 1860 census. John, born in 1846, and Amos, 1848. There was a grandson, probably, because the baptism, the parents were John Jones and Mary Corrigan, and John Jones didn't remarry, the first John Jones. So I'm assuming that this John Jones is really that John Jones who was born in 1846. So we now have 3 generations of Jones here. And it was sponsored by Charlotte Jones, who happens to be John's younger sister. I think Amos died, and he may have been the unnamed burial in 1853. I don't know. In the 1870 census, the family with the youngest children were back together and living in Randallstown. But the 1860 census shows Mary living next door to the Burns. I mean, they are the next record. Burns, the Jones. And I'm suggesting that the Burns made accommodations for Mary when John had to leave. And 6 of the 8 children were sponsored by one of the Burns family. The other two were the Ayers sisters, so. And given the census data and the sacramental record, this suggests that these two families had a close relationship. But the Burns were enslavers. And for us, from this vantage point in this year, that's really odd. This is another big file, sorry. There. So, how are these families intertwined? Well, I just graphed everything I told you about who was baptizing whom. All I've done is put it in a picture. So the Burns baptized the Joneses and the Ayers were baptizing each other. And I have this weird theory that the women that the Burns enslaved are the Ayers sisters. Because Ann Ayers was married in 1858. So she would be in the 1850 census, but not in the 1860 census if she were living with her husband and where he was enslaved. I have no proof for this whatsoever. This is a gut feeling. But I think these three families are very close. And I don't think from our vantage point we can understand the relationships, but I don't think it was employer-employee strictly. I think there was what we might call friendship, certainly a sense of responsibility towards each other, and it just raises so many questions, but it also sort of tells me that we don't really understand the culture of that time frame. And we have to be very careful of taking our perspective now and putting it back, 175 years. So, a couple of miscellaneous facts. Yes, the founder of the Baltimore Sun, Abel, had several grandchildren baptized here. His son, Edmund, had married Curly, had their children baptized here. She unfortunately died, and then he married a Lawrenson. And Abel, he bought the Lawrenson's estate, which was called Litter Luna. So it's, the upper echelons of society. And then this was curious. I call it a genealogical red herring. F.B. Lawrenson's daughter-in-law was Elizabeth Purviance Beatty. And I'm going, oh, I've got Christopher's enslaver. There's a Purviance, sitting there. And when I got into it, even though she's buried here, under the name Elizabeth Purviance, because that's what's in our records under burials, and I thought for sure that must be the family that had enslaved Christopher. But she was named for an aunt who had married Admiral Purviance, a Union naval hero. And he's only a distant relative of the enslavers of Christopher's family. That ancestry record I found of the Purviances could take it back several generations of Purviance slaves, and I'm going, okay, you can't just go by name. So the conclusions. It's complicated, but the sacramental record was incredibly rich. It does paint a picture of a very active faith community, but it is far more heterogeneous than we would have ever thought. And the relationships found do not necessarily match our assumptions of antebellum Maryland. Now, you will notice I have not answered the question that I posed in the first slide. I'm going to answer that. So, who was Maria Jones? She was the daughter of John Jones and Mary Martin, sponsored by Mary Burns at St. Charles. Her baptism on August 15th, 1848, is the very first sacrament ever performed at St. Charles. But she wasn't found in the 1850 census with her parents. So who was Maria Jones for us? I think her short life has far more significance than one would expect. She was really the start of our sacramental life here, and our sacramental life is the foundation of our Catholic faith. She represents our beginning, but not one of prestige or wealth, but rather one lowly and humble. Does that ring a bell? The impact on us of her short life from a marginalized population reminds us all that God does not see as man sees. And in gratitude, I want to thank the 175th Anniversary Committee, Father Canisius and the parish staff, and parishioners past and present, and the good Lord, who sees us differently as we see ourselves and makes lives meaningful in ways we may not fully comprehend or appreciate. Thank you very much. Thank you, I appreciate it. And if any of the families you recognize those names, I have more information. Just contact me. I can send you, the various links that I already have, so you don't have to go looking for yourself. So, yep. I'm sorry.
When did they actually do the sacrament of confirmation?
She's asking how old were the people when they did confirmation. As near as I can tell, it was the first one had an awful lot of adults in them, people who had probably missed confirmations. Later on, it was clearly sort of teenagers, young adults. So, because I could follow the generations. Steve. Well, the original church did not have a balcony, so most likely they were in the back. It was highly unlikely that they mixed. It just wouldn't have been done. Remember, pews are rented out, and they would not have been able to afford a pew. They would be standing. They might have chairs back there, I don't know, but more likely they were standing. But they certainly didn't rent a pew. I do not have the pew list for that church. It would be really wonderful to see who paid for the front pews. I think we can guess who was one of them, but we have no idea who paid for pews. Any other questions? Yes. Oh, yes. She's asking about Rosa Poncell. I believe the book has her in here. Obviously, Rosa Poncell, a very famous opera singer in the early 20th century. Her sister went here, but she would come and she would sing, and it was, I guess, quite glorious, but it's not the time frame I was studying. But it is mentioned in the book that Mary Jane Klein wrote. It's St. Charles. It's in the back. It's a long title. And you can feel free to pick up a copy. I think we're only selling them, what, $5? So, Yes, we had Rosa Poncela as one of our stars. We also had Blaze Star, sister here. Blaze. For those of you who don't know, Blaze Star was a very famous stripper on the block. Your sister came here, but she would visit. Yes, I have a couple of anecdotes that I won't tell. Maybe in the back later. Yes. He's asking about what sort of crops. By this time, tobacco was on its way out, and so they were, according to what I've been reading, they're starting to grow food crops for the city. He's asking why some of these rather well-known names were coming here. This was their summer area. They had their summer homes outside the city here. So as tobacco waned, estates were becoming available, and some of the merchant class from Baltimore City were buying estates out here. William Reed, who helped fund this church, and who was the one who freed Christopher Purviance, he was a merchant, but he had bought a summer home out here, and that's one of the reasons they wanted a church a little outside the city. And it was a lot more comfortable out here than Baltimore in summer. Right? Oh, how was colored? It was in parentheses, always COL. Sometimes with a little d. So yeah, it was always in parentheses. But I did find it unusual that is the primary term, whether the person was enslaved or not. Father White, at least, always just said colored. The sacramental record being in Find My Past was very handy, but it only indexed names. And it did not index whether the person was black or not, which I think it makes it difficult to use if you're really looking up an African American ancestry. The only site that I know of that uses race and nationality as an indexed parameter is Ancestry.com. By the way, I have transcribed the entire sacramental book. It's in an Excel spreadsheet. I'm cleaning up the names now because, like I said, spelling was an issue. Some names had like 4 or 5 spellings, but as I was going through the census records and everything, I'm going, oh, that's the same person, only it's this name, not that name, because I'm trying to transcribe handwriting, and Father White's handwriting, our first pastor, his handwriting was pretty good. Father Waldron, who was the one in the 60s and 1870s, his was horrible. Absolutely horrible. And I think he was a little disorganized because you would find, normally you would just, every sacrament you would do in order as it came along. He must have been writing it down on scraps of paper and finding them later, because you find them off, in the margins going, just sort of tucked in between 2 others. Yeah. Any other questions? Well, thank you very much for listening. It really has been a labor of love. it's been really fun to get to know these people. So, yeah.